Hello and a warm welcome to this brand new Sustainability Education podcast. I'm Dr. Stefan Siegel, postdoc researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. In sustainability education, ideas and assumptions exist that sound plausible, but that are at least questionable or even dangerous at a closer look. In this podcast, I want to discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. For this purpose, I invite world-leading experts on environmental and sustainability education, educational psychology, and myth and misinformation research. This podcast series is part of the research project Identifying, Understanding, and Challenging Myths in and about Sustainability Education. My vision is a more evidence-informed, effective, and ethically responsible sustainability education, and I hope to push the boundaries of knowledge in this field. I would be most delighted if you listened in and joined our conversation. You can do so on all the usual podcast platforms. Enjoy listening. Dr. David Orr is Paul Sears Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Environmental Studies and Politics at Oberlin College in Ohio, and currently a professor of practice at Arizona State University. He has served as a board member or advisor to 8 foundations, has been awarded 9 honorary degrees and a dozen other awards. He has lectured at hundreds of colleges and universities throughout the US, Europe, and Asia, and written over 250 articles, reviews, book chapters, and professional publications. Orr is author of 8 books, including Ecological Literacy, Earth in Mind, and Down the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse. In today's episode, we discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. I'm very delighted that David is here today and hope that you enjoy this episode. So, hello, David. Thanks for taking the time. Where are you calling from?
So I am in Oberlin, Ohio, Eastern time zone, about 35 miles west of Cleveland, Ohio.
That's very precise. Thanks for being here. Let's start without further ado with the first thematic area, understanding sustainability education and educational myths. What comes to mind when you hear the terms myths in and about sustainability education?
Well, let me back up and say a couple things about my upbringing. You said I was identified me as an expert in sustainability education. I am no such thing. I don't know that there are any. There are people who read more or less in the subject, but I don't consider myself an expert. I grew up in a home. My father was a college president for 17 years. So from the time I was 5 years old to the present, I've been in and around higher education. I have a minor in education from my undergraduate career, but otherwise I'm innocent of any great pedagogical knowledge. Yeah, what happened to me was in my teaching career, I started out in a small liberal arts college and then simultaneously working for Jimmy Carter as a consultant when he was governor of the state of Georgia and then on his presidential campaign. And then I went to the University of North Carolina, and there were some things that began to converge in my thinking. There was a time in the early 70s of a flow of really good ideas about education. E.F. Schumacher, his little book Small is Beautiful, and Ivan Illich and other people were asking incredibly profound questions about how we educate. And the root of the word education means to educe, which means to draw forth. And so what are we drawing forth? What is the mental apparatus that allows us to come forward? Later, there have been a whole series of great books. Emma Gilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, is one describing the way that the brain evolved. And it didn't evolve as one unified thing. It evolved kind of like you build a house and then you add a shed to the back of it and another shed this way, you take it up a floor. And the brain evolved in that way, as I understand it, rather haphazardly. But it evolved in a world of the savannah. There were predators and we came down from the trees, maybe a little bit too soon, but we we arrived here. So it was out of that background, reading and beginning to think about education. And so in the late 1970s, I launched with a brother an effort to build an educational center that would better connect the head and the hands and the heart. And so we purchased, this is kind of a wild thing you do when you're fairly young. We purchased 1,500 acres out in the Ozark wilderness and started an educational center. And the thing that we did, how we worked within those 1,500, everything within those 1,500 acres was curriculum. And everything outside of it was just outside of it. But the way we farmed, the way we built, the way we did everything within that, handled forestry and so forth. So the place became its own curriculum. And the ideas are not unique. Maria Montessori, John Dewey, Rudolf Steiner all describe something rather like that. So I can't claim any originality, but I hadn't read those when we started the project. So I was totally ignorant about a whole lot of things having to do with education. But what struck me was in the experience, particularly at the University of North Carolina, we'd taken this world, this booming, buzzing, confusing world, and we'd parsed it up into disciplines, each kind of hermetically sealed from the other. And the big conversations didn't happen much. What does economics have to do with ethics? And what does ecology have to do with economics? And what do our politics have to do with any of that?
So a lot of silos.
So the silos. And so the larger conversations weren't happening. In the meantime, we were becoming aware in that period of time of the enormous cost to environment and the damage humans were doing to the environment. Population of the world when I was born was probably, 3.5 billion people. And now we're 8 and still growing. Carbon emissions or CO2 in the atmosphere was probably, 350 or 60, and now we're 424. And so species extinctions were not even on our radar screen as an issue. It took people like E.O. Wilson and others internationally to identify that as an issue. And so began to think a lot about this. And that was where we began to think that the damage done to the planet's not primarily being done by poor people. It's being done by people who come out of places like Harvard or I'm sure not St. Gaudens, but the places where we educate the best. And so this wasn't a problem of ignorance in a certain kind of way. It was a problem of educated people. And that took me along with many others to begin to consider the kind of the DNA of Western culture. It's not long before you get into people like Francis Bacon, who proposed to put nature on the rack and torture her secrets out of her, misogyny, or Descartes, and the idea you think, therefore you are, but not that you feel or you're part of a community, therefore I am. There are roots to this. And then probably the most serious for us in our time was the industrialization. The places we called universities were built very much on the Germanic model. And the intention was to equip a workforce to support the expansion of the human enterprise. And I don't think that's all bad. I think what it was not very well considered. It was a human enterprise in isolation from the natural world. So my introduction to this was kind of happenstance. It was reading a lot of people, beginning to think about what an environmental perspective meant. I became good friends with Ian McHarg, the Scottish landscape architect. And while I was at the University of Pennsylvania getting a doctorate in political science, I sat in on his classes, and he was beginning to ask all the right questions about taking a landscape and how do we develop it on the landscape's terms, not on our terms. And so the field of ecological design in the landscape sense was born out of his work. And then architects worldwide began to ask the same questions about the built environment in cities and seeing cities as part of the natural world, as flows of energy, water, materials, and so forth coming in and then the waste products leaving. And we can do better than we have done in terms of human habitat, and particularly in the United States, where cities sprawled unbelievably because their land was so cheap. We didn't think a great deal about how we built on the land. So there were a number of questions coming up, and we began this experiment with environmental education. You asked in the terminology, if I back up and I say, how would a species have evolved to destroy its very habitat? And nobody planned it that way. It just happened. And so the root assumptions that set this machinery in motion were never thoroughly examined and dealt with. And so the key assumption was maybe taken from the Bible, that the book of Genesis, that we have dominion over earth and so forth. And so, let it rip, and we did. The caveats were not built into that. They were also assigned to be stewards of the earth. And the idea that nature, we should approach nature with a certain reverence and humility, a root word that goes back to soil. So you asked about the flaws in the Western worldview and the sustainability education. I think I've made a list of them here. Let me the understanding sustainability education. I want to begin first with what we call to be education. And the formula for that was set in the Germanic universities and then in the United States in places that were like Johns Hopkins research universities, or the older universities, Harvard and so forth, that were set up as theological training grounds, assuming that the theology was correct. But none of it was particularly informed by the way the world works as a physical system. And that was pre-ecological. I think the result was, and I'm reading off just my notes here, the result was we tended to have small conversations contained within these little boxes called disciplines and specialization. And you couldn't easily get out of that. I don't know what St. Gallen's is like, but business was a world of itself, by and large. If you went to most of the major business schools in the United States, and I spent some time at Wharton Business School, you're in a world of prices and products and markets, but it had nothing to do with the natural world. And those questions weren't asked and still are not asked as profoundly and as basically as I think they should be asked. So our conversations tended to be very small. As far as environmental education, it was conceived, I think, as an afterthought. And so the big curriculum, if you compare this to a house, the big house is already built and so forth, and yes, we'll let you build a little outshed behind the house, and we'll call that environmental studies. And by whatever name, it was an attempt to reconcile the human behavior with the way the earth worked as a physical system at all levels, all the way down to the garden level, up to the level of atmosphere and so forth. But environmental education was a remedial effort. And the problem it had was, as a remedial effort, it didn't pervade the whole curriculum. I think one way to think about it is as a corrective. Before you graduate, you're given, oh, by the way, you live on planet Earth, and this is how it works. An alternative way to think about it is that every discipline needs to be infused with environmental awareness. What does it have to do with law? Well, that's an interesting question. The environment in the American Constitution, it doesn't appear. Property appears, and we own chunks of land and the rights of property and so forth. Posterity appears one time, and that was in the preamble of the Constitution. So we have to, the very legal structure by which we organize our affairs was pre-ecological. But the same could be true of any field that you talk about. In your field of business, business was just there. Resources were there for the taking. They had no prior rights. Animals were just part, as Descartes had it, just part of the world machinery, and they had no feelings or presumptive rights. The politics, the field in which I did my graduate work in, had nothing to do with environment. We defined politics as who gets what, when, and how. But the what ought to include clean air, water, climate stability, wildlife, soils, forests, oceans. But we didn't include that. And so most every discipline was autistic to the natural world. It was simply left out. And so along comes environmental studies or sustainability education or whatever. And we find that the disciplines we try to influence have professionally been trained to be autistic. And then the way we think about this, to advance in a discipline, the reward structure is to stay in your box and to publish profound articles in unread journals and get tenure and promotion and so forth. So the reward structure is centripetal. It pulls you into a small conversation instead of centrifugal, launching you into a larger conversation. Yeah, and both of those are important. I think we need specialists, but we also need people who ask big questions, and they should be equally rewarded. Or perhaps the bigger the question, the greater the reward. I think that the assumptions behind the university were that knowledge was a good thing. All of it was to be advanced. I am writing another article right now, and I pulled out one of the sources. This is taken from an article, Robert Stinsheimer, who was a biologist by training and a president when he wrote this of, I think it was University of California at Santa Cruz. But he begins the article called The Presumptions of Science. He begins by asking, can there be, quote, forbidden, or as I prefer, inopportune knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Could there be knowledge, the possession of which at a given time and stage of social development would be inimical to human welfare, even fatal to the further accumulation of knowledge? And he goes on from there. If you ask the question, however, as he posed it, the answer you get back is, oh, he's such a Luddite, and what a ridiculous question. But then if you run the film up to the present, and you say, are we equipped to handle artificial intelligence? Creating a cold, inhuman, incredibly smart form of intelligence that is carbon-based, not or silicon-based, not carbon-based as we are. And you and I have had stubbed toes, pet dogs and kitties and broken hearts, and we've lived and we have an emotional life. Artificial intelligence will have none of that. And so should this be forbidden knowledge? It's probably too late to forbid it, but it certainly is inopportune. We have no way to think about this. There are no guardrails around this prosthetic device that will be much smarter than we are. How do we use it? Should we use it? Should we deploy it here but not here? I mean, these are the big questions. And so I think the university was not equipped, as we understand it, to ask those questions in a fundamentally important way. All this, I think, is to say that, back on my notes here, that we developed environmental studies programs or sustainability programs by whatever name as islands in a larger sea that gave us no particular standing. We didn't very often try to integrate these throughout an entire curriculum. That would be with too much resistance by specialists. There's another misconception. I'll leave this one kind of aside, but we didn't build into environmental studies programs, generally speaking, much real thought about governance and politics. The article I sent this morning on the missing aspect of environmental education gets into this point, but this was all something over here that if only we are smarter, if only we write the right articles, if we have the right presentation at a professional conference, it'll all be all right. We left out the politics of it, and so that it meant that we couldn't go down to the local coffee shop or the truck stop and get a hearing from people who weren't exposed to this kind of thing and know where to think about it. So fundamentally, I think it is very much political. And then a couple of other things. I think we labor under an assumption that ignorance is a solvable problem, that we're ignorant, but it's a little bit more research will be less so. And I think what we're discovering is the more we know, the more ignorant we become. That knowledge is a way to generate awareness of ignorance. And now we're dealing with a whole new thing about the cosmos and a universe of universes and black holes and white holes and all of these things we're discovering. And so astrophysics has been a way to discover how ignorant we really are. And every question leads to 5 others.
Absolutely.
Every question we answer leads to 5 more. So I think that there's, let me end it there with on this question with, if we were trying to adapt to a planet with an ecosphere, what are the behavioral characteristics that we have to manifest? And then what are the mental processes? How do we think about that aspect? And how does that thinking and that recalibration of human behavior and thinking best come about? And my answer is a very tentative answer. It was in the short piece I sent you about small places. I think we need to operate at 2 different levels. One is at the university level, reforming itself along the lines we can talk about later. The other is the small experiential aspects, places like Schumacher College in Devon, England, and you would know many, many more throughout Europe. The small places where you can reduce these big questions to a sizable and digestible information that can be absorbed in all kinds of ways. So we discovered that we learn in all kinds of ways. One is experience, but we separated the brain, and then half of that goes one way, and then the body and the hands and so forth, and the heart is a whole different thing. But the goal is a unified human being, always a work in progress, but where analytical and emotional skills infuse each other, much as Ian McGilchrist describes. And since we learn a great deal by doing things, the hands are an important pedagogical tool. Making things has always been an important thing. And then very smart people with lots of degrees without a heart are dangerous. And so somewhere in the curriculum, we need to learn or relearn empathy, collaboration, generosity, kindness. And those don't necessarily figure in the industrial catalog or curriculum. Those weren't traits. If you had them, that was fine, maybe, but I think we need a different approach to human traits. So the sustainability education has got to be a more complete endeavor. The last thing I'd say is this, and then I'll turn it back to you. I think what can happen in formal education is just a start. So you're in a school for 4, 6, 10, 12 years, whatever. I think that's the start, and the end goal ought to be seen learning as a process that goes on throughout life. And the world looks different at my age than it did to me when I was 20. And it leads me to a second thing, that what happens in a university ought to be contingent. You license architects, you license lawyers, you license doctors. And the reason is a license is not a permanent grant. It's a temporary grant, and you have to go back for retraining. And so a degree in any profession, it might be that we ought to renew degrees by having those given degrees at graduation come back in 10 years or 15 or 20 years and go through a new round, let's say a year at public expense, of relearning what your field is about. Doctors have to do it, engineers have to do it, lawyers have to do it. So why not begin to think about not degrees, but a license for a given period of time? And then you have to come back to relearn. And in almost every field, I think what you'd find in relearning is that the field has widened. We now understand the interrelatedness of knowledge in a way that we didn't before. We understand a lot of the questions asked when I was growing up and going to college in the 1960s and 70s. Those are not appropriate questions anymore. And the knowledge base and our opportunities to do better, I think, are expanding. So let me stop there. Redirect me to something else.
This is very insightful, and a lot of what you said resonates with me. I think we need places where we can breathe sustainability, where we can live it outside of these silos. I wonder, in the last decades, various forms of education have been developed that highlight different aspects of sustainability, environmental stewardship, social responsibility. You already mentioned environmental education, but there's also education for sustainable development, or sustainability education, or regenerative education. How would you evaluate these newer ideas? Is there real development there, or is it all environmental or even general education?
Frankly, I don't know. You'd have to sample those courses. My hunch is, and it's just a hunch, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity and a lot of, as Churchill once put it, terminological inexactitude. And I think that by whatever name, I think certain things have to occur. I think there needs to be a time, rather like Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, pointed out in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you have to learn to articulate the problem. You have to get words and problems together. And so the language is important. And the language of environment is about interrelatedness, systems thinking. And once you get, I think in a lot of ways, systems is the most radical word in any language, because it means we are unavoidably connected. And if you say I'm connected, well, then I'm also obligated. I cannot ignore the connectedness. It's a two-way street. I think, therefore, I am could mean, as Satish Kumar puts it, you are, therefore I am, is a better way to put it. And we live in this pattern of an unfathomable connectedness in all kinds of ways. The air you and I breathe was once breathed by, Socrates and Buddha and Jesus and Adolf Hitler, for that matter. So we have commonalities that we share. And I think the word systems is at the heart of it. That's a mental change, but it's also a behavioral change. And I think that's not far from the word religion, which means the root word means to bind together. And binding together is a systems concept. And so we're in this mental shift of understanding our interrelatedness. And I think it's a shift from pronouns I, me, and mine to more to we, ours, and us. Seeing ourselves in this progression from ancestors to our descendants. We're simply in a line of evolution. And then I think in my experience in education, it's important to begin to integrate hands and problem solving. One of the things that we did at Oberlin years ago was to get students involved in designing and building an environmental studies center. And we had about 250 students work on the project, and we ended up building a building entirely solar powered, a zero discharge building, no waste product leaves it, eliminated toxic materials and glues and so forth. It's still standing. It's aged. That was nearly 25 years ago now. It's aged extremely well. Now, one example, you could begin to see a future that was otherwise just very abstract. The sustainability education, whether it's a farm or it's a building or it's urban renewal or it's something, there needs to be some direct component to it. And so the sustainability education, I think, must imply some confidence with the natural world, how to build, make, garden, farm, and so forth. And I think without that, it's simply an abstraction. And what we did in the building, if I had talked only about, let's say, climate change and how awful it is and so forth, I would have done my students a disservice. They need to know that. Then they need to know what they do about it. How do they live a life against those realities and join the larger effort to preserve life on the planet, not just preserve it, but let it thrive on the planet. But to do that, I think they need the systems perspective that we're in this interrelated, and that is a spiritual or religious injunction also, and then the competence to act on that. And I think I want to define hope as the verb with its sleeves rolled up. And man, if you were hopeful, you would take action. If you're optimistic, maybe not. If you're despaired, you will not. But I think that we need to provide education that gives the wherewithal to live differently and joyfully. This is not all gloom and doom. I think it's also a matter of celebrating life and celebrating the things that make it worth living.
I was very intrigued when I read your seminal book, Earth and Mind. I was a bit confused about what education now is. Is it a solution, or is it the problem or part of the problem? I always thought regarding these grand challenges that we face as humanity, the more educated people are, the better. Did I fall for a misconception there? Or how would you resolve this seemingly contradictory issue?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean, it's certainly not an attack on education, but it's a call for a more thoughtful development of education. What we assumed, I'm speaking mostly as an American, what we've assumed is that a college or university degree adds to your net income of your life. You'll be much more successful and so forth. So if you get the degree, you can translate that into money. The idea, the root word of the word education is to draw forth, educe. And that has nothing to do with money. That has a great deal to do with character and creativity and compassion and what is drawn forth. Can education be a danger? Sure, you bet. I mean, we have any number of things that have happened to us by educated people or people who didn't ask the right questions. Thomas Midgley Jr., who invented chlorofluorocarbons and also leaded gasoline. As far as I know, he holds the world's record for banned substances. And here was a guy, incredibly brilliant, product of Cornell University, who invented chlorofluorocarbons, but didn't ask what happens to those when they're released into the environment. Well, they go up. And what do they do when they go up? They eat ozone. And so we didn't ask he didn't ask, and I think it's a fairly typical thing. What does this thing I'm introducing into this world of life and plants and animals and soils and so forth, what does it do to the natural world?
So a limited systems thinking.
Absolutely. So the cure for that is complicated, but at a minimum, I think the cure would have to be that no student graduates from any college or university without understanding how the earth works as a physical system, i.e., what planet they're living on, and how does it work. I would add to that other requirements like democracy and civics and so forth.
Absolutely.
So they understand the proper way to engage the public in these things that have huge effects on the public and its children and grandchildren. I think a lot of this strays into politics. In the case of Thomas Midgley Jr., we also had no institution within our governing society to appraise new technologies. And in the book I just edited called Democracy in a Harder Time, there's one of the essays by a guy who studies technology very well, David Gustin. And David has a question of, or a proposition, there should be no innovation without representation. And say, let's think about artificial intelligence or nuclear weapons, for example, or any number of other things before we deploy them. We find it's too late. And the institutional barriers that Robert Sincharmer talked about, or institutional structures to adjudicate those things and control them and put them to good effect or not let them have bad effect, don't exist. And so we're getting ready to deploy artificial intelligence. We've been warned about it from Mary Shelley to Stephen Hawking, and have yet not established any kind of guardrails or governing procedures around that technology. I think that's a minimum kind of thing. Let's start make sure people understand what planet they live on and how it works.
I would fully agree. Let's move on to a second thematic area. When you think of your decades of experience in research and practice in environmental studies and sustainability education, what are some of the most pervasive misconceptions that you have encountered from colleagues or students? Are there certain misconceptions that you have found more often and more common?
I think that the most common is the idea that somehow this is a not rigorous discipline, because you're talking about things that have to do with values, environmental ethics, or things that we don't understand very well. What are our relationships to animals on the planet? Should trees have standing? Lots of big fuzzy questions that go back to the heart of the Western enterprise, which was to dominate the earth. And if your goal is to dominate the earth, quantitative analysis comes in very handy. You got tons and board feet and so forth, and that comes in very handy to dominate the earth. That's very, quote, rigorous. But there's a fine line between rigor and rigor mortis. And in this case, the environmental studies is often accused of not having analytical rigor, which I think is just nonsense. We have our students we increased the science component of it. So you had to do a lot of your coursework in the natural sciences, in physics and biology and chemistry and so forth.
So basically a myth about the field sustainability education, that it's rather a soft discipline.
That's right. No. And it's the hardest discipline there is. I mean, how do we reconcile humans to the earth? That is a question that is huge and complicated and will require all kinds of analytical rigor, but of the more the sort that's more common to philosophy and so forth than perhaps to econometrics. But I think there is another myth. I think that is a good field, but it should be kept over here. It should not be. We should not be asked in, let's say, economics or business, maybe, to reckon with environmental issues. We're just about business. That has to do with economic growth. And so I think those would be the two that leap to mind. But the idea that, again, that ignorance is a solvable problem pervades all of it, that we can just more research. And I'm not sure more research gets us there. I'm not sure this is a problem that is researchable in that particular fashion.
I see. I'd like to ask you a personal question, if I may. If you think back to the beginning of your professional biography, what misconception or misconceptions did you yourself have maybe about environmental or sustainability education? And what did you most help overcome these misconceptions?
Well, one right at the bat, I had a dean tell me in the 1970s that he thought environment was a problem now, but it wouldn't be in a few years.
Mm-hmm.
So you can read that in one of two ways. You can read it that it's all over, or you can read it, it's just a fad. But the misconception was that this was a temporary thing
Mm-hmm.
and that we would solve it by better technology. Better technology is certainly helpful, but it's bigger than simply a gadget problem. I think the other way is not so much a misconception, but I think when we built the building I mentioned, it was a 14,200 square foot environmental studies center, entirely solar powered, zero discharge, no waste product left, and so on. And what that gave us in a concrete form was an example of what we were talking about as sustainability. First of all, the process was inclusive. We had 250 students involved in a process and a design team with 24 outside firms, architectural engineering firms, and so forth. So the process, the material sourcing of the building was different. So we aimed to buy from sustainable sources and sustainable forests and so forth and so on. The final product was different. It was entirely solar powered. It had technology that allowed us to purify wastewater on site, basically an indoor wetland. It was basically a swamp we built indoors, and it worked just fine. So the misconception was, I think, built in that if we just talk about ideas, they will manifest. I think it's really important to actually manifest those ideas in some form, fashion. And building's only one way to do it. But what that did
was to walk the talk.
Yeah. Gave us and since 70 to 80% of our sensory apparatus connects to our eyes, we are visual creatures. We believe what we see. And so and that worked, I think, extremely well. We created a model of ecological design, but also gave the students a model of interdisciplinary education that involved actually making something, taking their ideas into the real world. But we had students research materials, read material safety data sheets, and work with engineers and architects. The people in sustainability world weren't just abstractions that they read. They actually worked with some of those people to make this building. This is 23 years ago now. And it worked tremendously because I think it changed something in their mind. This was no longer just this big abstraction. It was something that had specificity. And you could scale the specificity up. The next project we did was to work taking the principles of that 14,000 square foot building and expanding it to the whole city of Oberlin, a town of 9,000 people. So we inaugurated the Oberlin Project. And among other things, the town and the college both are moving very quickly to becoming carbon neutral. And it changed the discourse around the town. You don't run for office here in the city without acknowledging the importance of sustainability. But we took ideas that were scalable. And I think for the students involved, that gave them a sense of, aha, this is possible. It isn't just all a bunch of bad news. It's possible. We can do it. Here are the ways in which we can do it. And by God, we did it. We did certain things.
Very visible, and you can make learning progress visible, and it's very hands-on.
Yeah, that's right. And they learn analytical skills, but they learn. There was a case. I don't know if we have time for this, but one quick story. I was on a foundation board in California, and we had a request from an inner city school, poverty school, from the kids in a class, middle school class. They wanted to build a school garden. The trouble was they would have to take out an asphalt parking lot to build their garden. So we gave them a grant. They did it, and they put in the garden. And from that garden, they learned they could change the system. You could take out an asphalt. You can grow vegetables. You can eat those vegetables in your school cafeteria. You can learn biology, and you can sell your excess produce to a restaurant called Chez Panisse, which is a very famous restaurant in Berkeley, and you can make money. So they learned a whole bunch of things, but we had one of the kids come in afterwards and ask, what did he learn in the project? And he said,
super cool.
Well, he learned that asphalt wasn't forever. Asphalt wasn't forever. He learned you can change the system, that the world is still rich in possibilities, not just wring your hands over the latest ain't it awful data. But I think that's an important message for education, to introduce young people into this world where we have to move extremely quickly. One last thing, and this is out of context, but one last thing back on the myths. One of the myths, and I put it as a kind of a pre-analytical myth. Nobody really thinks about it like this, but there is, I think, by and large, in most places, kind of a lack of a sense of urgency. We don't know what to do with the almost daily reports that come out that, oh, the North Atlantic conveyors, Antarctica is melting faster, and we just don't have time to do stuff. We have a hard time thinking like a fire department. And so one of the myths is that the world can afford complacency. That should have been taken out of our thinking a long time ago. This is not time to be complacent. This is time for well-considered, thoughtful, well-organized, but urgently executed action. And I think that you get this at the COP meetings. Oh, we've got time. We've got
absolutely.
We've got 10 or 15 years before you have to reach a 1.5C deadline. Well, no, you didn't.
No,
or no, we didn't. It hit us this past year. We were over 1.5C over the course of the entire year 2023. There is a sense of urgency, but that means, how do you do things urgently without causing despair? And I think environmental education has an answer to that. Most of the environmental educators I know are really good partiers. They can have a good time. Celebration of life, I think, ought to be part of the protection of life. And that means it needs to have this. We need to have good parties in sustainability or regenerative education, by whatever, and celebrate the earth and this amazing gift of life and beauty. So it isn't all gloom and doom, but I think at the end of the day, it's about how we can mobilize human abilities in the defense of life in a way that's thoughtful and creative and enduring.
When you think of the myths you mentioned, what do you think? Where are they coming from? Why do we hold these misconceptions?
I think, let me give two answers to. One is, some of those myths are baked into the modern philosophy. I mentioned Bacon and Descartes. You can mention Henry Ford or Stephen Jobs, but it was baked into our modern philosophy of development and progress and all that. And some of it is more subtle and I think sinister. Edward Bernays, Bernays, was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he left Europe and came to the United States early in the 20th century and set up a major advertising firm. And following Uncle Sigmund, he knew the human personality. There was a superego up here, but you don't sell things by dealing with, oh, it's the right thing to do. There's the ego here, that's the rational thing. And you can sometimes get people to behave rationally, but more likely you get them to behave at the id level, at the id where the 7 deadly sins reside. There's lust and anger. So when he was hired to sell cars, he knew that cars, for men in particular, were signs of sexual potency. So he sold the annual style change. You change the chrome on a car and you drape a woman over the hood of the car. This is a sign of sexual potency. So cars sell. For women, he organized an effort to get women to smoke cigarettes. And so he had, coming down Fifth Avenue in New York, he had this group of debutantes walking down the avenue, and they stopped right in front of a group of cameras and hitch up their skirts and pull out a cigarette and put it in their mouth. And the catch line was, debutantes light little torches of freedom. You get there, they were pissed off at men. And so you tap into the anger from women to oppressive men, and they're going to smoke. But that was a huge part of the smoking market. So you could sell cigarettes. So you think about this. In the century since, we have probably seen on average somewhere, I'm told, between 3,000 and 5,000 commercial messages a day. So that's selling the sneakers, food, anything. And so what happens in sustainability classes over the course of, let's say, an hour, fights again against that fact that the kids we're teaching are on some kind of screen 9 hours a day on average. That's an American number. And they're bombarded with advertisement after advertisement. And sometimes it's only an insignia on a car or a shirt or a ball cap, or it's a pop-up on your iPhone or your computer screen or television screen or a billboard. But 3,000 to 5,000 advertisements per day. And so what we do in classes is remedial. The tidal flow, our mindset, is this vast effort to make us dependable and dependent consumers. And sustainability education doesn't compete well with that.
No.
But the myth is that we can grow the economy forever. We can consume as much as we want. Wherever it itches, we scratch it. When we want it, buy it. If it can do it, do it. That's the commercial message.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow we are independent of the gravity mass of environment and ecology and also social obligation. We're individual consumers.
But in fact, we're all connected.
Yeah.
A key task of my postdoctoral research project and my habilitation is to develop an sustainability education methodology. The psychologist Lilienfeld and colleagues coined the term psychomythology to represent the vast body of misconception, urban legends, and old wives' tales regarding psychology. I would like to create a web of connected or a wiki of myths in and about sustainability education and their refutations. With view to your years of experience in research and practice in the various educations, such as environmental education and so on, which of the myths you mentioned should be, or which myths should be definitely included? Do you think that there are some foundation myths or other misconceptions that a lot of other myths build upon? So that was a very long question. Sorry for that. Which myths should be included in such an SA mythology?
Good. That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it the way you need it. I'm reading my notes here. The goal is to begin, if I leave the question aside for a minute, go to the goal of education. Broadly speaking, is to begin to recalibrate the way we think and the way we act with the way nature works over the long term. So that if that's the goal, how best does that work? And I think the question then is what part of the mind are we trying to affect? The advertising, Edward Bernays' work was to hit the amygdala, the source of fear and anger and so forth, and get people to consume because they're greedy or lustful or whatever, and they'll consume.
So an effective part, basically.
Yeah, and the goal of the myth here is, I think that we will, in some form or fashion, think our way through the crisis, and the frontal lobe can do the heavy lifting. And I'm not neuroscientist enough to know what part of the brain is where compassion begins and openness to wonder. But I think that the kind of human response will have to be somewhere between Albert Schweitzer's view of reverence for nature, but that's still a thinking process, or Rachel Carson's emphasis on the sense of wonder, just awe, the amazement about life. Ed Young, who writes for Atlantic, had a book which I forgot the title of, but it's how animals perceive. And it's like walking into a wonderland of how animals with different antennas and sensory apparatus and sometimes just their skin perceive things. I mean, my God, we live in a miraculous place. And it's the sense of awe, not the sense of mastery. Absolutely. That probably is the thing that would be most useful. And in that, a kind of humility, how do I say this, kindness and compassion, a sharing, and of the kind that, the growth economy does its best to atomize us and make us individual consumers. That's how the economy grows. An economy based on a different myth. Of course, the myth there is it can grow without limits, and the world simply just, we ignore the fact we live on a finite planet. But there's a myth underlying that about ourselves, that we are just consumers. And so somehow, by whatever name it is, we have to learn obligatedness, our intrinsic obligation in life, and the reciprocity of being givers and takers in this world, which requires humility and other kind of traits we don't much aim to create, I think, in the academy. They're simply, they're not against it, but it's not what's cultivated.
So if I understood you correctly, solely a cognitive approach to this problem, to the myths, wouldn't work. We can't just have more facts. We also need to address like the socio-emotional or the affective components if we want to be effective as environmental educators.
Yeah, that's well said. I agree with the way you said that. I think there was a project I was familiar with some years ago that was organized by a football player after his career, and he dealt with young kids who were emotionally damaged, inner city kids, emotionally damaged, and they couldn't relate, and certainly not to a white guy like me. But he created a farm where some of these kids could come out and they'd be assigned an animal, a horse, a dog, whatever it would be, and they would have their own animal. They had to feed it and care for it. And they did it with, they learned love, learned to relate to the animal in a way they couldn't relate to a person. But they learned the art of relationship with another live being. And then they could hopefully grow that into a relationship with people, which they seem to do. I think something like that has to happen within education. We need some way to get out of ourselves and find relationships. And I don't think that's something you teach. You can't have relationship 101. You can develop all kind of studies and all kind of percentages. But this, I think that we will best be able to deal with this by engaging in ourselves more directly. And that's not opposed to education. I think the part of education, and one of the pieces I sent you, I described Schumacher College, but there are hundreds of other places, thousands around the world, where you can acquire that kind of knowledge and input. But the phrase I use is it's kind of like salt in the stew, small by volume, large by effect. Changes the flavor of what an educated person can do.
Are those projects basically examples of a whole school or a whole institution approach in some sort?
Yes, and they're the kind of things that, the schools, I think, that do the best job in this. My granddaughter had a time to go from college for a semester to Peru and study high elevation farming with Peruvian farmers. And I think it changed her perspective on the world. So she got interested in it, and she realized that that their farming system was embedded not in books and so forth, it was embedded in the culture. The culture was the knowledge carrier. And it raises questions about environmental knowledge. The goal of environmental education ought to be to put itself out of business. That a respect for and competence within the environment ought to be like breathing. We don't have courses in breathing. You don't have often courses in walking, but we need to have environmental studies basically with the goal of putting itself out of business because it's become so culturally common. Recycle and you purchase certain things or don't do certain things because you just don't do them. And you don't have to stop and think through everything. And so that's a smarter culture. So the goal I would say the goal of environmental education is to put itself out of business. This is not a growth industry. Yeah, you grow to a certain point, but when it comes to a tipping point where this is just the way we do things.
And where maybe sustainable behaviors are like the default mode or our habit.
And then the goal of public policy then is to make that easy and make the other thing hard. It's easy to do something that's organic and natural and uses your feet and your intelligence. Hard to go to the store and buy something.
Which is currently not the case. Often.
No, not at all.
When we come back to this mythology, if you were to develop such a mythology about sustainability education myth, how would you do that? How would you categorize the myths? How would you organize it? Do you have any idea on that?
That's a good question. I'd wonder, one way to do that is to think of yourself as a novelist for a minute, situated maybe in the year, I don't know, 1500 or 1200 or something like that. And you're writing a book about how we became consumers and destroyed the planet, and then reason back to the critical elements or times or events that made that possible, even desirable. And I think you would have to have the myth of a corporation, for example, being a person. In American law, corporations have the rights of persons. Well, you and I are persons, so you'd be one place at one time, except on Zoom. And then you have limited assets. You're going to live for a while, and then you're going to die. Corporations have eternal rights, and if you say a corporation has the right of freedom of speech and the things that we're guaranteed as persons, then you've got real problems. Corporations then take over the world. So that's one myth. There's a myth, I think, too, that you can be secure. And the security is a function of force and violence. And I think the myth behind the Israeli-Hamas crisis or the Putin-Ukrainian crisis or the U.S. crisis, any number of things, is that more weapons make you stronger. More weapons, as Gandhi pointed out, I think, make you weaker. You hide behind them. They're shields. And you don't deal with root problems that cause human discontents. There's a problem that happiness is relevant to the amount of stuff you have. And of course, every study of happiness shows these two curves. You have more stuff going up, poll and try to find out how happy people are. It kind of flatlines. It goes up for a while, and it flatlines. More stuff doesn't make us happier. And to the contrary, it can make us a lot more miserable. And then mastery of the earth. We assume that we're masters of the earth, but In fact, the Earth has never been more capricious. As our mastery's gone up, what else has gone up? Bigger storms, rising sea levels, longer droughts. I mean, the Earth has become a pretty dangerous planet. It wasn't always quite that way. And so there are a lot of fundamental myths, but they were baked into, perhaps we got it out of the dominion passage in the Bible, or maybe just by happenstance, or just by a few people's actions. But the idea is somehow that we can dominate the Earth.
So you would consider that kind of a foundation myth where a lot of others stem from?
Yeah, myth or assumption. And then in the early science, in Bacon's work in particular, he was a founder of the Royal Academy of Sciences, I think, in London and so forth. But science became something like a god. And the problem with science is, from my perspective, it's not really scientific enough. And by that, I mean, it's not asking those larger kind of questions. Why do we do this? What's this for? And those get complicated and messy. I know that. But why do we develop, I mentioned chlorofluorocarbons, but why did we develop nuclear weapons? Why did we, and now we're developing an intelligence that could very well evict us from the planet? Why do we do these things? And the capacity to think about this stuff is, I think, crucial to the human future. But it's simply, how does it happen? Why does it happen? Your question is brilliant, because you're getting at the substructure of a society, what makes it tick. And I think the foundational myths of the growth economy were built into all the structures of our business world and economies worldwide. And now the neoliberal worldview is pretty predominant throughout the world.
If we move on to the next thematic area, what do we do about it? How can we effectively deal with these misconceptions, or maybe even paradigms or worldviews? From your experience, what are strategies that have been effective in dispelling such myths and in evoking alternative mental models in learners?
Let me modify some of what I've said to say this. If you did a poll of everybody in the world and you asked, do you want to drink dirty water? No. Do you want to breathe dirty air? No. Do you want climate chaos? No. Do you want to say in your future? Yes. And so in a way, Stefan, we have been very successful in this movement. That's the questions. 90% of the world, or certainly 80%, would answer, no, I don't want to drink dirty water. I don't want to breathe dirty air. They're there with us. And which leads me to two conclusions. One is, we have to make visible the world we want to take them toward. And that's important to do that in terms of parkland. And the building I mentioned, the Environmental Studies building, we later did an entirely solar-powered hotel conference center. Entirely solar-powered. We're in a cloudy part of the world. But make it manifest and make it visible. The more important thing, certainly in America at this time with Donald Trump coming back and all that, is to recognize that all this stuff is political. And so one of the myths here is that, oh, I'm all for all this environmental stuff, but I don't do politics. That's something over there. No, it's not. And even in the statement of saying I don't do politics, you're doing politics. There's
Absolutely.
No way to be at apolitical. There's no way. When you opt out, you're simply supporting the politics of the status quo. And so I think that, and what my work right now is involved with at Arizona State University, and then a group of universities in Denver and elsewhere, is involved in engaging people politically around the issue of democracy and climate change.
So to build agency.
That's right. And begin to understand we have to engage that process. We have a meeting coming up on what does democracy look like, an environmentally sound democracy look like? What are the characteristics of it? And so that meeting takes place out in Denver. But the book, Democracy in a Harder Time, one of the essays I included in there is on the Constitution and climate change. I think I mentioned earlier in the talk or our conversation. And there are others coming up on religion, governance, federal agencies, one coming up on AI, artificial intelligence, but beginning to mobilize people to think that democracy and climate change are flip sides of the same coin. It was democratic failure of democracy that allowed climate change to get out of control. And so now we have to rebuild a democracy that works, and a democracy then with foresight and the capacity to act effectively. And so that's why in the United States, this election of 2024 is critically important. If Donald Trump comes back in office, I'm coming over and living with you in Switzerland. This is I'm getting out of Dodge, so they say. But I think that to understand that these things are fundamentally political, And sustainability education, by whatever means, needs to provide verbal competence, analytical skills from a sustainability perspective, and competence in natural systems, whether it's gardening or forestry or something or building. We need to have competence about how we remake the human presence in the world. But it also needs to be political in a very fundamental sense. We need to be involved in education. I think European communities are further along in this than we are in the United States. But I think there are clearly around the world, there's a majority of people. And so the only way Putin and a Trump or Erdogan so will stay in power is to suppress the natural impulse to join together and do things in a progressive way. And to do that, they have to also make us afraid of each other, afraid of different colors, people, afraid of different personalities and nationalities. So fear is what drives a lot of what ails us, I think.
I basically see it the same way. Democracies are having a hard time at the moment, basically all over the world. But as you mentioned, I think sustainability and democracy depend on each other very much. If we don't have a functioning political system, then personally for me, then there is no hope that we will manage the grand challenges that we face. For me, it's always important to bridge research and practice. And from your perspective, how can educators and practitioners be better equipped to identify, analyze, and dispel myths in and about sustainability education?
Well, I don't have any. I think there are two things that I found I do in my own. I read everything I can find. So my library, which is part is behind me, but I probably have a library of 30 or 40,000 books read. The other thing is I think that being active and doing things and working with in collaboration with other people. I don't think sustainability gets very far if it's just a series of individuals. I think it gets much farther as organized effort. So working with friends, working with different organizations, learning how to be effective, understanding where to be effective and how to do it, I think is really important because our own psychic, we talk about sustainability education. I worry about the sustainability of the educators. There's a different, if we lose our morale and our focus, then we're not very effective. And so getting out for a walk in the woods, canoeing a local river, getting out and playing soccer, just being outdoors. Because just to restore our own psyche and souls, I think is an important thing to do. And I think the rest, I believe a lot in the word serendipity, in the chance occurrence of put yourself in a situation where good things may happen, but you haven't planned them. But you join together with friends, and where 2 + 2 can suddenly become 22, not 4. And I think that's really an important part of this. Where sustainability education, by whatever name, goes, I don't know. The end goal for me, again, would be to put ourselves out of business, be so successful that environmental consciousness it pervades the curriculum. It's just the way you do things. And again, we don't have classes to teach people how to breathe. We don't have classes much and not teach people how to walk. We just learn to do it, and we do it. But I think in the meantime, that may be hundreds of years away. I don't know. But in the meantime, I think one of the concerns I have is we would fall into despair. And I think the antidote there is to bond together, come together, and whether it's soccer leagues or Friday afternoons having a beer or hiking the woods or climbing a mountain. I mean, I think those experiences aren't trivial. They're important. And I think that travel, even though air travel costs roughly, I guess, 3% or so of global emissions, I think it's a good thing to travel and begin to see other situations. So I think it widens the larger world that we're aware of and being part of. And I've been to Russia a couple of times, not recently, but the empathy that you develop in going to places and seeing the plight of people and seeing also that they do some things a lot better than we do. If you compare, say, Copenhagen and Los Angeles, we need to make cities more like Copenhagen and a lot less like Los Angeles. But you go there, you feel that, and you find out there are answers to some of the problems that we think are beyond us.
And you broaden your horizon and maybe find out about similarities, but also differences in doing things.
Right, absolutely.
In the next area, I would like to do a quick round on statements. I have a few prepared, and I wondered whether you could indicate whether you see them as myths, facts, or something in between. And if a brief explanation of your reasoning, if you like. statement one would be there's no consensus on what sustainability education is.
I would say, take the word out, I would say there's either some consensus or about, I think there's a more or less I think that a lot of the quibbles about sustainability education are quibbles around getting the name right. And those quibbles owe, I think, in a lot of ways, in my experience, to egos. Somebody has an ego and says, well, I'm into regenerative. I think where there is not a consensus is whether sustainability education ought to be integrated in a whole curriculum or separated out as a part.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, statement two.
Statement two.
Sustainability education is just a hype or a passing fad?
Well, I sure hope it is not a passing fad. I mean, we need, until we get to the point where it's it's built into the way we automatically behave. It's like teaching a person to walk again after a broken leg in a car accident, and you better have those crutches. So there, for a while, it's a crutch, but also to help us to think through what it means to be in a reasonably sustainable or durable role with the natural world and also our posterity. What does this mean? So the questions being asked are good. Number three, there's already factors over as, I'll bet you can go through most college and university catalogs. Yeah. Okay, we don't need that course. That's trivial. We don't need this course. That's trivial. I think it's a little more complicated. The fact is, I don't know that there's anything really trivial in education, but I know there are trivial ways to teach anything. And so I think there's enough room to begin to say, if you start to add a course as a faculty member, put together a course, the first thing you want to identify is what planet you're on. How does this planet work? How does it affect how I teach anthropology or business or, law or whatever? And there, the curriculum is not already packed. It's pretty sparse. And to get people to reconsider how the environment plays a role in their course or their area. Number four.
So being expected to integrate sustainability into my teaching interferes with my academic freedom.
Well,
sometimes you hear that around campus when you work with lecturers in further education.
I see the argument. You don't be told what to teach or how to teach necessarily. But it's also a little bit like, let's say you're teaching aeronautics and how people fly airplanes. And by God, I don't want to be taught the laws of gravity. There's some things that are essential to a learned approach to a subject. And so sustainability by whatever name you put on it is an important consideration. How do I make this important to our drive to make a durable civilization on a planet with a biosphere? And so I understand their argument. You don't want to be told what to do. But on the other hand, you wouldn't hire somebody to teach aeronautics that didn't believe in the laws of gravity. Interesting theory, yes, but I don't want to teach it.
The last statement, sorry.
No, sustainability is itself a value. The idea of being value neutral is itself a value. I mean, you're caught in a terrible conundrum if you try to make it value neutral. If you say, well, we really don't care whether life survives on the planet or not, so we're just going to teach you blah, blah, blah. No, it has to be value laden, not neutral. And it is by definition. Once you say sustainability, you said, well, we think that the longer term has some cachet or some standing in the way we do things. That's a value. So sustainability education, it's rather, that argument is really, I've heard it, but it carries no logical weight. There's no way. And I had a dean once tell me, remember, he said, David, you got to remember that Oberlin College is a college, not a cause. And I said, you can't have a college without a cause. If you say we have no cause, then our cause is the status quo or ignorance. If you say we have a cause, then the question is, what is the cause and how do we fulfill that cause in our own curriculum? But sustainability education is clearly value laden.
I would agree. I see a lot of parallels to political education. Sometimes teachers at schools or at universities are afraid to be too political in their classes because they are afraid that they are then not neutral. And with regard to sustainability education, some fear that they might pose an ideology upon students or learners. So
I think that there are ways to deal with that. And the way I think I would approach it, and I have approached it, is to say, here are my values. Number one, life is important. I think life is a value, and protect it requires certain kind of things. Other people are valued. And so the way I teach this course is going to say the word here is we, and the we includes future generations, other life, other species, and so forth. I think you put your values up and put them on a board. Anybody doesn't want that, fine, take another course. But I think that to be explicitly honest, if I say, on the other hand, I'm going to be strictly value neutral, I'm not going to accept your opinion, then I really don't care whether we live or die. I don't care whether there's war or peace. I don't care whether we drive species into extinction or preserve them. I don't care about forests, we keep them or not. It's just, we'll study this, but we won't take an opinion that deforestation or forests are a good thing or a bad thing. We won't take that opinion. That's nonsense. That's a course not worth offering. And it's very confusing to young people who, at the ages we're talking about, from say 16 to 25, they're trying to understand what values are worth the expenditure of their life's energies. They want to know. And they also want to know what we think. They're looking for some examples. So rather than sneak these values in surreptitiously, I put them right in first class. This is what I think. This is what the course is about. And this is why I think those things. And if you want somebody who is going to stand value, on the sidelines and between life and death, fine, take that course. That'll be offered over in the mortuary services.
With that, we're already at the last thematic area, the future of sustainability education, educational myth research, and the closing of the interview. What do you think are the most pressing questions that future research on myths in and about sustainability education should address? Do you see any gaps in the current literature there?
Well, I think the most pressing question has to do with whether we're going to make it or not. We're in a five-alarm fire. I mean, in a previous life, I was a fireman in a rural area. And so you get called out on a fire, and your goal is to put out the fire and save somebody's life who is trapped in an upstairs bedroom. It is not to arrive and do research on the theory of combustion. And so I think for environmental studies people, we need a sense of urgency about what is coming and what we need to do. I think we need probably less research as that is typically defined as pedagogy, and more research on how do we activate our students to do what? What will they need to know? And I don't know if that's a research question or simply a question for a group discussion. I started classes. We have a major event coming up with students across the United States in August. And one of the questions is what do you want to know? What skills do you think you'll have to have? From first responders, because events, fires, and storms are going to get bigger and so forth, all the way over to lawyers and business people trained to begin to rethink their profession. I mean, how do we provision ourselves sustainably, honestly, ethically? How do we build, and so forth? So I think the sense of urgency doesn't deprive us of academic rigor. We sometimes confuse the number of big words and the number of footnotes with rigor. And I think that's not the case any longer. If it ever was, it's not the case in our circumstances. But I would start the fundamental question, I think, for young people is, what do I do? How do I do it? Who will help me? Who are my heroes or heroines? What are the kind of people, what's the kind of person I want to become? Give me an example. Alexei Navalny's death a couple of days ago is a hell of an example of courage. And above all else, I think our young people need to see examples of courage, courage and creativity combined. Here's Navalny. The last week of his life, he was, a report I heard, he was trying to organize his guards and other prisoners into a union. Incredible sense of humor. He got the humor out of that. He's going to his death. I mean, he knew he was going to die, just in a win maybe, but the humor of that and the creativity, that's the kind of models. Greta Thunberg, we need to give them models. I'm not sure how this fits the question about research, because I think they don't need more academic papers. They need solutions, and we better get them pretty quickly.
So basically, if I understood that correctly, you would say we know about psychological barriers that might hinder people from getting into action, getting into agency. We would need to move on beyond that and just do it.
I would modify that only by saying just do it. I would ask what needs to be done, at what scale, where, how, by whom, and begin to organize differently. We don't need more. I write stuff, but honestly, we don't need more papers. I sent you a couple of papers I wrote, but we don't need more of that. What we need are well-considered actions. What we need are the people like Alexei Navalny
But for the well-considered actions, don't we need like evidence where we build upon our professional actions?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't mean to overspeak there. We're starting a conversation about creating a global center for democracy, one in Athens, Greece, one in New York. And so what you're asking is very much part of the curriculum. We're identifying a network of people in the global south, bringing them into, in our case, New York, in groups of roughly 50 for a month. And the curriculum includes earth system science, democracy, organization, media, communications. And so this is a large endeavor. We're aiming to build a network of 10,000 people in 10 years in the global south, networked. So the questions you're asking, there aren't research questions. They're questions that people need to know across different cultures, different languages, different circumstances, different political systems. And what can we give them? And so a lot of the questions, what do you need to know to go back to your home and be effective? And as much as anything else, they need to know they're part of a network. So the goal of this is to begin to find examples and networks so that when bad things happen and hard times come, as they will, they're networked. They know who to call. They have friends and examples of how to deal with issues. So your questions are good ones. And I think you're right. Considered action, knowing where to intervene in the system. One of the first things we did here in the Oberlin Project, Danella Meadows was a famous woman who co-authored Limits to Growth and so forth. She wrote a little essay called Places to Intervene in the System. And there were 13. Top of the list was the obvious things. You start intervening in the system to change the system by changing policy and so forth. You get down to number 13, it's changing mindsets, how people think, their paradigms and pre-analytic worldviews, all the myths that you're describing. Yeah. But when you begin to deal with myths and paradigms, that gets dangerous. That's where people get shot, kicked out of office, fired. Martin Luther King in our history here was a myth changer, the myth of white supremacy over black people. And of course, he got killed. If you're a Christian, Jesus was talking about love your neighbor as yourself, and he gets killed. And so you go down, when you begin to attack that number 13, how the world views, that's where it gets dangerous. That's where you strike at the amygdala. So one of the things we want to do with this World Democracy Center or centers, plural, is to begin to develop capacity to identify myths and then the wherewithal to deal with them. But anyway, that's a really good question.
Could you recommend any literature or resources or individuals, apart from those you mentioned already, who did research or did try to address psychological barriers in sustainability education?
I think the subject of myths isn't just about sustainability education. It's embedded in the way cultures work generally. And there are all kinds of myths, and to go after them field by field. In the field of business, for example, the myth we can grow the economy forever.
Absolutely.
On a finite planet. And every field in politics, America there's a large literature about myths in American history. The myth of white dominance, the myth of Native Indian inferiority, the myths of growth, the myths of the frontier. And so you can find any number of books recently in the last, say, 10 years about myths in American history. I think I would treat this more generally as a subset of a larger set of questions about why we are so prone to myths. And they're not all bad. I mean, myths are how you organize some worldview. But I would go back to,
if you see it on a more abstract level, those are basically narratives.
I think if, the myths in environmental studies basically get at the limits of environmental studies. For example, embedded in a university, is the university the appropriate vehicle to recalibrate human behavior with the way Earth works physically? That's the myth. We're just a little subset in that myth. We can accommodate ourselves to that larger myth and have a prosperous environmental studies program. But the myth of knowledge is a solvable problem. It isn't. Or ignorance is a solvable problem. It isn't. And so I've talked about that previously.
But what would be your take on that? Is are universities, higher education institutions, the right vehicle, or do we need another form of formal education?
Well, the 2-page essay I sent you, I think I answered. We need a university. We need places where there's concentrated knowledge. and disciplinary focus. And there's a lot of good that happens in universities, but we also need that salt in the stew, that time to go to Schumacher, the time to hike in the mountains, that time to take a trip across the ocean. We need time away to put all that into perspective. That's what's missing, I think. Yeah. And we also need, one of the things we're aiming to do also in another leadership development program here is to have young students, 18 to 22, and they need to put a face, a real live face on something. So the program we're assembling has to do with, would have to do with internship programs. So they could go and work with somebody in whatever their field. It could be somebody at the World Bank, it could be somebody in Switzerland, it could be somebody at a city council meeting in a small town in California. And then come back, and they need to be put on a fast track of leadership. We need young people in leadership positions faster than they have ever ascended before, but we need them well trained, but they need role models. And so they need to understand that the world isn't perfect. The idea you've got a hero, heroes always have feet of clay, and they've always done, bad things and so forth. So it's not a matter of finding perfection. It's a matter of finding a role. So they need role models, model themselves after. And so in that case, leadership is very much about how to create images of the future based on real people, real lives, real problems, and let the experience speak through what they do professionally, but accelerate their advancement into positions of authority, whether it's in the economy or it's in government or a corporation or a city council or whatever. But we need examples of real leadership. And so finding those people that can help motivate and clarify.
Before we conclude, is there anything else you'd like to add or emphasize regarding myths in and about sustainability education or education in general?
No, I think I would, the thing that I missed in my interactions with education, as a faculty member or whatever, were two things. One is the willingness to suspend beliefs, to engage in a larger conversation. We need to be talking across discipline boundaries. We need to dissolve those boundaries. And the other thing was, I think, often a lack of urgency. The academy doesn't have a fast clock speed. No. And the world needs something that can move rather more quickly. And so those two things, it kind of breeds complacency. The coziness of a disciplinary department. You teach the same courses over and over again, and after a certain point, you become complacent. I've done that before, and I do it so well. My student evaluations are really good, and therefore I don't need to change anything. And I think the lack of adventure is one of the things. Sustainability education ought to be seen as an adventure and an ongoing series of questions. I don't have answers to what should people learn. I really don't know exactly how to motivate them. Well, I really don't know exactly. But what I found in my career is that when we launched the effort to build an environmental studies center, all of a sudden I was interacting with architects, engineers, and people who had done some things I admired. I learned a ton, and it was really important, and it was a lot of fun. We did the same thing on an agricultural project. I learned a whole bunch about soils and animals and wildlife and so forth. And the idea of adventure and movement is really critically important. I think that's a wonderful final word and a wonderful notion, this notion of adventure. Thank you so much, David, for your valuable insights. It was really a pleasure listening to you, that all our listeners find this interview as fascinating as I did. Thanks for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. Well, thank you. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Let's stay in touch. Thank you for your interest in the Sustainability Education podcast. Did you find the insights helpful? Do you have any questions, comments, or objections? Then feel free to get in touch and share this episode with others. This podcast is produced by the Institute of Business Education and Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for listening, and hear you in the next episode. Bye-bye.